following on from the last presentation, when you think about Main Street, this is, it's such a series of, we used to call them tropes, now that we call them memes. There's such a ton of these about small town America. And the key part of this is the idea of Main Street. So in the world of the modern sort of image stereotype of Main Street is it's a commercial street, but it's also part of a stable community. So like it's New England, precursor. This is a community where people live their entire lives there. They're born there, they're raised there, they go to school there, they find their significant other there, and they live the rest of their life there. And in that entire world is played out on Main Street. That's where they buy stuff. That's where they get a job. If they're successful, they become a banker and eventually own a bank or own a store. So it's very much a pretty insular, inward-looking community. And if you think about it, that's like the absolute quintessential opposite I mentioned before of places like Virginia City and sort of the Wild West, where anyone could be who and what they wanted to be because they basically could reinvent themselves. In small town Main Street America, you right from the time that you were cognizant of it, you had to sort of follow the rules because you were going to be with those people around you for the rest of your life. So it's a very controlled, very structured landscape. Now, of course, it never actually worked that way. And this is why it's so favored of literature and movies and everything else. But nonetheless, it was seen as a very, on one hand, constraining, but on the other hand, hugely comfortable because it was a very predictable world, it was a very stable world. And in many ways, that probably was true, and to a certain extent. The Great Depression probably just absolutely blew this apart. In fact, you probably say the 1920s sort of blew it apart, but the Depression sort of finished it. And so small town America and Main Street, which are the same thing, because Main Street's sort of the personification of small town. Small town America, if it included like the residential structures I showed at the end of the last podcast, would, you could fit those into, sort of any other setting. It's the Main Street that then justifies and gels that. So let's take a real quick look at sort of an overview of this, because this goes back to this whole sort of Calvinist perception of people in the world around us. Here we've backed out. We're still in Marshalltown. We've zoomed out. One of the fascinating things about the American way of doing stuff is the extreme geometric form of it. If we just really quickly, I'm making you sick here. If you just look at this, not only is the town structured in rectangular or square components, but notice how even the fields and everything else are structured. You basically put a square grid on the world. And when you think about it, the world doesn't work that way. In fact, if you zoom in back in here, you can see how, the grid has to deal with the fact that streams and such like that do whatever they're going to do. But notice how you don't really change it to match the world around you. You actually work the grid as far as you can, and you have sort of awkward components where the grid doesn't fit very well. But you don't change the grid. And occasionally you get areas that don't have this, that have more lack of linearity. I'm not sure about Marshalltown, but a lot of places, these would be rather upscale parts of the community where you find that the upscale sections are oftentimes the areas that don't have the linearity. But if you go into middle class, lower middle class parts of the United States, you'll almost invariably find them very structured in this form. Now, the other part that you see here, which, we already saw this a little bit sort of peeking at it, is that what you find is in the older form of Marshalltown, as in the rest of the United States, is because you have to remember we're talking about a period of time when transportation was either on foot or pretty much by horse or horse and buggy. So it was very limited in terms of distances. You'll find that folks that had the most money will live within a couple of blocks in a particular neighborhood around Main Street, because this is your financial sector. And of course, everyone that lives in Marshalltown works in Marshalltown in the old form. What you would find is the folks that live out here in the edges will have significantly smaller houses than the folks near the center. And this becomes part of your socioeconomic patterning of the American settlement, is that the poorer folks live further distance away from the economic center of the world. Now, when the car comes in the 20th century, this just revolutionized this. That probably completely is what wiped out downtown Marshalltowns and other main streets, is because the car did several things, not the least of which is it suddenly meant that, if you work in Marshalltown, if you run the bank, why shouldn't you live down here further away from everyone else? You can have a nice big house. You don't have to deal with many neighbors. And you don't have to occasionally bump into people that are lesser than yourself. So what happens is the car radically changes all that. Let's very quickly zoom in here. Because what this also does is it radically changes the whole concept of downtown. Oops, I missed downtown here just a two. You have to remember, if we're looking at this in the way that it was originally built. So if this is circa 1900, for example, or 1880s, this would be gravel. And you wouldn't, of course, there'd be no stoplights, there'd be none of that. There was just a flow of traffic through here. And people would, go down the street and by foot or on a horse or horse and buggy, and they would go down the street and they would interact with other people. And so, it's in that context. The sidewalks would not be particularly wide, but the most important thing is it'd be very little street space. The actual area for, traffic would probably be about 2/3 of these two lanes. Now, when the automobile comes in, this radically changes everything, because the automobile suddenly moves from, within a short period of less than 15 years, moves from being sort of an exotic commodity that had sort of specialized uses to being something that everyone has. And so all of a sudden what that does is that in many ways actually is the death of main streets. Because all of a sudden, if you've got a car, now all of a sudden those cars are going to be in places to be put. So now that you've got these automobiles here, now what you've now got is a barrier between people over here and people over here and what's going on in the middle. You now are jaywalking, which is a fascinating term because it didn't exist prior to the automobile, because the traffic was moving slow enough. You got run over by a horse, that's pretty much your own fault. But when the automobile comes in, the average speed of 20 to 50 miles an hour, massing 3 tons, if minimum, usually about 4 or 5 tons, especially that sucker. So what you suddenly have is you've now got this area of fast moving metal that now breaks up this side of the street from that side of the street. What that also means is, whereas before you could have a fairly large number of people socially interacting, now they can't. The people on this side of the street are going to have to yell to those people on the side of the street, and that's not acceptable. Also, what happens, if you think about it, everyone would have their horse, their buggy, they'd walk, and they'd be interacting here on foot. Now what you do is you go into the diner, pick up your takeout order, put it in your car, and you drive off somewhere. So the car becomes a little capsule of self. It becomes like a little protective bubble. And so the people in the cars really aren't interacting with the people on the street, except in that period of time when they get out, when they're out of the car. But you're also now not only can you be mindless about where you live, because you now got something that can go hundreds of miles in a very short period of time. But even more importantly, what you've got to understand is that in this context, you've now completely breached the whole idea that this street was a form of presentation. Things like storefronts only work if people are walking. Storefronts don't work if you're driving by. You can't look at the storefront. You're not going to, and you're not interested in it. So this whole world, from everything from the trim on the sidings here, the false fronts, the front of the building, the way the building looked, all of that was defined by people walking by and people, sort of interacting with this world on a constant basis. The minute that you bring this thing in, then that's gone. So the minute that the car becomes a commodity with the Model T and the Model A Fords and all that, then the days of downtown Main Street are just totally numbered. And this is one reason why when they try to revitalize main streets, it's incredibly difficult, because how do you get people back on foot when they're in cars? As we'll soon get things like Cock-Ockle, there's sort of ways you can get around that. You can have little parks. There's probably a parking area back here so people park their cars and walk. But then, the convenience of a Walmart or a Target where you've got a parking lot, you do all your shopping in one place. Unless you're some sort of a specialty store, you're going to have a real hard time competing with what they now call the big box retailers. And it's not just the big box retailers have a ton of different stuff in the store. It's also simply the fact that the big box retailers have enormous convenience, because you just take the sucker, you go and you park there, you do what you're going to do, and you leave. And in downtown, you don't have that. In downtown, you had to interact and move around. Like this lady, you have to carry stuff around and such like that. So it was a different period of time. And oftentimes what you see people now talking about, life was much slower and, people interacted more, and that's totally true. Having said that, I think very few of these people would want to go back to a period of time when you had to worry about the fact that the fastest you could get going was about 3 miles an hour, maybe out of 5 miles an hour on a bicycle. That's not a world which especially Americans are prone to thinking about. From our design standpoint or aesthetic standpoint, notice how this road then completely becomes, originally this was just a transit feature, and the main part of all this is the main street. But when you put the car in, now notice how the car is the main part of this, and the street's almost peripheral to it. The buildings are almost like framing the road, but they're not central to this. What's central to this is the automobiles and the traffic moving on the road. And so that completely changes the entire dynamics. And that's one of the reasons why, when we were working on the Main Street projects here, it was a little easier in Hawaii because, in a real knee-jerk way, if you could figure out how to get tourists to Main Street, then at least you could have a body of people who are going to be there. If you think about it, if you're here, if you're in Marshalltown, Iowa, you're not going to see a bunch of tourists there. So what is there about this landscape that would be attractive in a 21st century world, except as a capsule of the past? It's not really a functional part of the present, unless you have some sort of really exotic stores. And that's why you find, Main Street projects tend to work sometimes for a period of time. They make areas nicer. I think this section down here looks like it's been redone. But, in some way, shape, or form, since there isn't a lot of parking here, if you're a merchant, you have to have, X amount of foot traffic per hour. You have to have X amount of people walking by your front door every hour, just so that some of those people will come in and use that place. And given the limited parking here, if I was to set up a Starbucks type coffee tea shop, how the hell would I get enough people coming by every hour to even make rent, given the fact that they have to park this way? And so people parking down here are going to walk a half a block just to get a coffee? I don't think so. They're going to go to a drive-in Starbucks somewhere. And so what happens is you have a world that was based on a much more compressed, slower paced access. But it wasn't necessarily better. It was just different, because what you also had was a huge amount of social segregation based on, the access to Main Street. So it's a world that we're not really aware of anymore, but it still, in many ways impacts us. We still have a huge amount of images of this world. And in many ways, it's a huge part of the American existence. The idea of the small town where everyone knows each other and you can trust your neighbors and you all went to school together. You think about things like the senior prom in high school or junior prom, or whatever the hell it is. That really is a small town America thing. It doesn't work if everyone's strangers. So all of this world is a huge part of what Americans sort of collectively identify as what makes them themselves, in contrast to other places. But it's interesting, you could argue, at least for the last 100 years, it's been just slipping away really rapidly, to the extent now that it's pretty much, sort of a living museum. In many ways, there's not really a lot of difference between trying to revitalize this and Williamsburg. It's just Williamsburg is a lot older, reflects an earlier period of time, but they're all both pretty irrelevant in the world of the 2020s, especially in an Amazon online shopping world. The power of this image can probably best be seen if you look at Disneyland. One of their most popular attractions, and the one they really haven't changed much at all since they built the place in the 50s or 60s, whenever it was, is Main Street. This is a hugely compelling place. If you ever go to Disneyland, I recommend it, not necessarily to go there, but just to people watch. It's absolutely fascinating from the design standpoint of icon and symbol. In the fact that you get a staggering number of people. Almost everyone that goes down this street on any day in Disneyland stops and takes a ton of selfies and other pictures of this, because this resonates with people. It resonates with folks that aren't American because it's their image of the United States. So it's sort of like the way they see us, if you would. But it also resonates even more powerfully with Americans because it's part of the world that Americans see that is them. So even though, 99.9% of Americans have never lived in anything like a Disneyland Main Street, in fact, I'm pretty sure there aren't any. On the other hand, the iconography and the symbolism of the place is absolutely telling. And we'll see this a little bit later when we get into certain aspects of symbolism, but it's just gives you an idea of how powerful an example of this in surveys that Disney does. This apparently is usually among the highest 5 rated of all their, events or whatever you want to call them on their properties, is their Main Street. So it's a hugely powerful, emotionally and socially compelling piece of architecture. that entirely refers back to some place like Marshalltown, except it's chromed up and blinged up to the edge of it to make a fantasy version. And so what you get is people pay huge sums of money overall to come and experience this one. At the same time, it's very likely that they're within maybe 50 or 100 miles of a real main street that in many cases is completely gone or trashed. So it's, in fact, a good example of how this works out is notice how you don't have cars on this main street. So it's pedestrian traffic, except for the trolley, I think, or something that runs through here. So this is a pedestrian friendly main street. And that's not what you see in places like Marshalltown or even Lahaina, Front Street, whatever. So Main Street is really important because even more so than the Western image, Main Street both goes back to referring to earlier periods, say, Calvinist New England. But in many ways, it becomes it was and still is the identifier for the American sense of a group. And it's entirely based on the concept of community, a stable community, a community where everyone knows each other. Now, in that, if you think about it, one of the side effects would be if you have a home at this time. Let's stop this and we'll switch back to this. Okay, so we're back in Marshalltown. Now, if you look at this, keep this in mind when we go to the next of our areas. So here's Marshalltown. We're now somewhere in town. This is about, I think I intentionally picked this is just almost a block off of downtown. This is a classic, again, totally accidentally. What you've got here is the classic sort of, area idea of small town America. You've got all these residences, orderly, very structured, spaced out, nice, linearity, just like we saw in the overview. You've also got a church at the end of the street, which is quintessentially American. So in some ways, it's actually very similar to the New England village. One of the interesting aspects of this that changes radically between this and our suburban concept is, and I'll just give you a hint, you don't have a lot of large picture windows here. In fact, you look at these houses, none of them have picture windows. You got windows, but you don't have picture windows. Now, if you think about it, this house here is a quintessential example in many ways of the American fantasy single family home. You've got the shutters, which are not functional. You can see in many of the shutters here don't even fit. The shutters up there, I can almost guarantee you, well, maybe they work. This is Marshalltown. So what you've got is you've got a lot of, relatively inexpensive architectural affectations. You've got the American fantasy porch. Americans love the idea of porches. We call them lanais here, but lanais are actually used a lot more here. But this increases the curb value of this house tremendously over the place next to it just by virtue of having that porch. Americans love the fantasy of people sitting in rocking chairs, drinking a beer, listening to a baseball or football game on the radio, or I suppose now on their tablet, and watching the kids outside playing. The neighbors walk by and everyone talks story. That's sort of quintessentially American. And this place personifies it. Now, having said that, not only is it sort of fallen a little bit on hard times, but if you notice, it's also part of this, again, this whole structured world. But you have to remember in the period this was built, it's got to be at least 60, 80 years old, I would think. So these two houses are probably about the same period. In fact, I would say these three houses all look like they're pretty much the same age. So you don't need big picture windows because guess what? You know your neighbors because your neighbors always live next door to you. Your kids played with their kids, and then there was a kid down at the end of the street they didn't like, or or maybe the old obnoxious neighbor that lived in the house over here. But this is a place of permanence. It's a multi-generational place. It's a multi-generational town. It's a multi-generational society. It's a multi-generational community. And so to a certain extent, you're not going to have a huge amount of affectations. You don't need a huge amount of look at me here because everyone knows who you are. If you suddenly blow 20 grand and come up with a fancy new roof, knock this down and come up with big Grecian Corinthian pillars here, and just redo this front yard and make it really spiffy, but you're still you and your neighbors are still them, everyone's going to think you sort of lost it because they know you. They went to school with you. They know who you're married to. They know what your life's been. They know what your kids are like. So changing what you look like on the outside, in terms of display, is not going to change the person they know because they know you too well. And so this becomes really important because on one hand, this is the world that Americans like to think that they're part of. This is the part of the world that Americans would like to live in. But the reality is that we don't and haven't for at least 100 years because it's been replaced partially. And we'll just go back and see this again since I'm sure you're already tired of this picture. So that community has been replaced by this prefab that we've seen a gazillion times already. But notice the huge difference between that and the house that we were just looking at. This has an incredibly large, not functional porch, but the reason for the porch is still the same. You want to have rocking chairs up here. Kids are going to play up here. The old folks will sit up here. Everyone will hang out. They'll interact with their neighbors, etc. But notice how the whole front's totally different. This is a home of display. This is a home to impress people who have never met you. The whole term curb appeal, when you think about it, only works with strangers. Curb appeal wouldn't work if you're a realtor trying to sell this house in Marshalltown to people who've lived their entire life there because they know who lived there. They know the whole history of that place. So if you're going to sell a place, you want it to look like this, but you want to sell it to strangers because then the look of the place, you're selling the idea that they can make a statement to people they don't know about what they are. If you want to think of it, it's the equivalent of leasing a car. You can afford a car that you can't afford because it's not really yours. It belongs to the dealership or the bank or whoever. But for 3 years or whatever, you get to drive around and people that don't know you go like, wow, you must be successful. You got this Mercedes, this BMW or whatever. In reality, you can't afford it. So this is the same thing. You take functional features and make them non-functional because you want to puff up to those that you don't know and present a you that's, pretty much almost entirely false when you think about this actually being a prefab. There's very little about this house that's real. It still works as a residence, but from the affectation of the turned rails, the enormous and unnecessary number of railings on the porch, the goofy light collectors here that don't work, even the way that you've done the windows, they're not functional rectangular windows like you're seeing here. These are basically screaming, look at me windows, the non-functional shutters on the side. This place is designed to make it look like you've got more money than you do. So it's designed for a group of folks that aren't going to know each other. These folks aren't going to be all that interested in the neighbors because they're not going to live next to the neighbors for the rest of your life. This is temporary people living in a temporary place. And when you think about it, that's even more of an impact on the places like Marshalltown because now you don't have people living in the same community for their entire lives. So if you think about it for a second, that even more impacts the idea of what a main street would be because now you've got to have a main street that basically attracts strangers. Whereas in the past, when Marshalltown was more successful, Main Street was for locals only. If you want to think of it, you almost never saw strangers, and if you did, everyone probably noticed the strangers. So from a design standpoint, you're going to have a lot of windows in a place like this. And a lot of these will have traditionally in the United States in the last 70 or so years, large picture windows, because you want to have a spot where people walking by on the street can look into part of your house and see the display that you've left in terms of furniture, etc. That makes even more of a statement about who you are in terms of impressing strangers. The idea of the living room or dining room that's then exposed to outside view.